Okay, Brother Ray. I don't have time to talk. I wish to air propaganda and control of the public mind, Noam Chomsky. And we'll listen to him for about 32 minutes. And then I will read the Tao and we will work on changing our minds. What are we thinking? Where are our heads at? Okay, so let's get to that DVD or that CD right now. And play.
It should be understood to be a real war, and it's not a new war, it's an old war. Furthermore, it's a perfectly conscious war everywhere, but specifically in the United States, where there happens to be a very free country, but it happens to have a highly class-conscious business class, and always has, and it's very free and open, so you have a lot of information about it. They talk, you have their records, and they have long seen themselves as fighting a bitter class war, except they don't want anybody else to know about it. Occasionally someone else gets the news. Rather famous case, which I'm sure you know, was Doug Fraser about 20 years ago, 1978 I think, when he pulled out of the Labor Management Council and condemned business leaders for, words were roughly like this, for having decided to fight a one-sided class war against working people, the poor, the unemployed, minorities, even members of the middle class, and for having torn up the fragile social compact that had been achieved during periods of growth and prosperity. In fact, had been achieved primarily, although he didn't say this, primarily through rather militant struggle, very militant struggle under harsh conditions back in the 1930s. Now, the only thing wrong with his statement is that it was way too late. In fact, that war that he's talking about was initiated as soon as the fragile social compact was established back in the 1930s, and very openly. There's no, you don't have to go to secret records to find out about it, nor do you have to have been at the wrong end of the clubs when the strikes were broken up in the late 30s to know about it. It was completely public. The reason it's not well known is because neither the educational system nor scholarship like Harvard and so on pay any attention to it. It's not a topic that's studied. So there's no doubt that one of the major issues of 20th century history, surely in the United States, is corporate propaganda. That's a huge industry. In fact, it extends over obviously the commercial media, but the whole range of systems that reach the public, the entertainment industry, television, a good bit of what appears in schools, a lot of what appears straight out in the newspapers and so on. Huge amount of that comes straight out of the public relations industry, which was established in this country early in the century and sort of developed mainly in the 20s and on, and has become an enormous industry. It's now spreading over the rest of the world, but it's primarily here. And its goal from the beginning, perfectly openly and consciously, was to control the public mind, as they put it. And the reason was that the public mind was seen as the greatest threat to corporations. That's from early in the century. Business power was strong, but it's a very free country by comparative standards, and it's hard to call on state violence, not impossible, but hard to call upon state violence to crush people's efforts to achieve freedom and rights and justice. So therefore it was recognized early on that it's going to be necessary to control people's minds. I should say that's not a new insight either. You can read it in David Hume and the Enlightenment, where it was already recognized. In fact, go back to the earliest stirrings of democratic revolutions in England in the 17th century, and there already was concern that we're not going to be able to control people by force, and we therefore have to control them by the means, controlling what they think, what they feel, their attitudes toward one another. I mean, all sorts of mechanisms of control are going to have to be devised, which will replace the efficient use of force and violence that was available to a much greater extent earlier on, and as has been fortunately declining, not uniformly, but often declining through the years, particularly here, leading to the need for other methods of control. You don't have to move very far from the Cambridge elite to learn about it. The leading figure of the public relations industry is a highly regarded Cambridge liberal, Roosevelt Kennedy liberal, died recently, Edward Bernays, who wrote the standard manual of the public relations industry back in the 1920s, which is very much worth reading. Remember, I'm not talking about the right wing here. This is way at the left liberal end of American politics. His book, it's called On Propaganda, or maybe just Propaganda. I should mention that terminology changed during the Second World War. Prior to the Second World War, the term propaganda was used quite openly and freely for controlling the public mind. It got bad connotations during the Second World War because of Hitler and that sort of thing. So the term was dropped, and now there's other terms used. But if you read the literature in the social sciences and the public relations industry and so on, back in the, say, 20s and the 30s, they describe what they're doing as propaganda. This manual is for the rising public relations industry, and he opens by pointing out that the conscious manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is the central feature of a democratic society. It's the essence of democracy, as he later pointed out.
The essence of democracy.
We have the means to carry this out now. He said we have the means to regiment people's minds as efficiently as armies regiment their bodies. And we must do this. First of all, it's the essential feature of democracy, but also, sort of footnote, it's the way to maintain power structures and authority structures and wealth and so on, roughly the way it is. It's worth remembering something else that they usually don't teach you very much about in school, and that is if you go back to the origins of American society, it was founded on the principle that was stated very explicitly by the leading framer, James Madison, at the Constitutional Conventions, that as he put it, the primary responsibility of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And Madison recognized, he's a smart guy, that this was going to be a serious problem if a democratic system were established. It was going to, if people had the right to vote, he used England as his model. England was the model for democracy in those days, right? It's like, we're talking about 1780s. And he pointed out in the debates on the Constitutional Convention, something which everybody ought to read in third grade in a free society. I mean, this is the origins of our society. He pointed out that in England, if they had the right to vote, which fortunately they didn't, he said pretty soon you would find people calling for redistribution of property and for a tax on property rights, for what nowadays we call agrarian reform. It was mostly an agricultural society. He didn't use the term agrarian reform, but the same thing. He said people will start calling for agrarian reform. Obviously that's intolerable, and we have to protect our own society against that kind of injustice by ensuring that the rights of property prevail. He recognized that, he said it's a problem now. He was already concerned in the 1780s by what he called symptoms of a leveling spirit. That is, people are trying to, feel that property ought to be more equitably distributed. That's a danger. But he said that the danger is going to be become much more severe over time as more and more people are marginalized and dispossessed and secretly yearn for a more equal distribution of life's blessings. Now, if those people get to vote, we're going to be in trouble, because it's going to be hard to protect the minority, the opulent, against the majority, which is what government's all about. And he therefore designed a constitutional system which was intended to prevent that danger. The system, the way he set it up, he and the other framers, because it was virtually unanimous, there was virtually no disagreement about this. The one person who might have disagreed, Jefferson, was not part of any of this stuff. The constitutional system, as he designed it, was supposed to put power in the hands of the wealthy, who are the more capable set of men. I'm quoting. Power must reside in the hands of the wealthy, the more capable set of men, with the general population fragmented, factionalized, dispersed, in conflict, and so on and so forth. Well, this is like, we're now 1780s. Okay, it's been a pretty stable system. And as it's been harder, the franchise has increased, so over time more and more people did get the right to vote. And that just raised the danger. Furthermore, the power of the state to coerce by violence, and that includes the power of private power, like the power of, say, Carnegie to hire Pinkertons and so on. As that has declined, the need to resort to these other measures of factionalization, instilling hatred, marginalizing people, straight propaganda, and so on, that's increased, and very consciously. So by the time you get to the 1920s, where I started from, it's recognized that huge resources must go into the conscious manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses, and we have to regiment them, their minds, as well as an army regiments their bodies, and we have the methods for it, and those methods are advertising, entertainment, straight propaganda in the media, schools, so on and so forth. The 20s was an important period in this regard. It looks as if labor is under attack now, but remember, in the 20s it had been smashed. The major American historian, labor historian, David Montgomery, has a book which you probably know, or should if you don't, called The Fall of the House of Labor. Very, sort of standards, important book on the history of the labor movement. It ends in the 1920s, because that's when the House of Labor had fallen. After, with a lot of violence, in that case, state violence, Wilson's Red Scare, the leading labor leader was in jail, Eugene Debs, where the New York Times had said years ago he ought to be sent, and so on. There'd been a big strike wave at the end of the First World War, smashed, labor movement destroyed, the whole thing wiped out. As Montgomery points out at the end of his book, labor had been virtually destroyed. Working people had to privatize their lives and aspirations. They sort of work out survival strategies for themselves, not with others, because the modes of cooperation and common struggle had been eliminated. And they did it, he ends up by saying, in a most undemocratic America, which is true. It was a highly undemocratic country, using a combination of modes of violence and coercion and repression and increasingly propaganda to prevent the dangers that Madison was worrying about, almost 200 years earlier, that more and more people would secretly sigh for a better access to life's blessings and might even do something about it if they had a functioning democracy, which therefore couldn't be permitted. I should just comment, in fairness to James Madison, that these remarks are not quite correct. The reason was that Madison was pre-capitalist. He's like just about everybody, Adam Smith, all the great figures from the Enlightenment, they're mostly pre-capitalist and very anti-capitalist in conception. You can't say they're anti-capitalist because there was no modern industrial capitalism around for them to have an opinion about. And this is a matter of interpretation, it's a matter of how you read text, so you can read them a lot of different ways. But the way I read them, they were very anti-capitalist. That includes Adam Smith. and I think you can demonstrate that. But certainly Madison was. He believed that when he put power in the hands of the wealthy class of men, you know, the more capable set of men, the wealthy of the country, that they were going to be, as he put it, enlightened statesmen and benevolent philosophers who would devote themselves to the welfare of all. Okay, that's a very pre-capitalist conception. You know, that once you give power to the hands of the rich, they're just going to be benevolent philosophers, and they're going to devote themselves, you know, every minute of their day to the welfare of everyone else. I mean, it's like what corporate executives tell you. Now they're sort of understand you have to say that, but by now, you know, nobody, I suppose, nobody believes it except the people who read these, you know, watch these movies, which show you how it works. In those days, Madison really believed it, and he very quickly discovered that it wasn't true. Within a few years, by I think 1792, he was already very upset about the fate of this democratic experiment, which he thought was failing. He condemned what he called the daring depravity of the times, as the business leaders who have now been given power use that power, he said, to become the tools and tyrants of government. They overwhelm government with their powers and combinations, and they're bribed by its largesses. And they're just serving self-interest, you know, not the interest of the general public. And he thought that was deplorable and so on, but that's because he perceived the way the system that he had designed was actually functioning. That description, you know, rhetoric is kind of nice, and people don't use fancy rhetoric like that today, but it's a perfect description of today. What's called the industrial capitalist system today is in fact one in which private power is the tool and tyrant of government, overwhelms it by its combinations, is bribed by its largesses. That's a pretty good description of 1997. With all the changes that have taken place since 1792, there's a good deal of stability to all this, including the commitment to the principle that the primary goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. You read yesterday's budget proposal carefully and you'll get a good example of how that commitment plays itself out. And the increasingly significant idea, overwhelmingly significant idea, particularly among liberals, you know, like say Bernays, that it is necessary to control people's minds because they're too much of a danger. We, as one of the leading, take a look at, say, the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, and you know, big encyclopedia in 1933, so this is still pre-Second World War. There's an entry, there actually is an entry on propaganda. Remember, propaganda was a usable term then. And the entry on propaganda is written by a very distinguished political scientist, liberal political scientist, Harold Lasswell, one of the founders of modern political science, in fact, of communications and so on. And it's worth reading. It's a page or two, you know, Xerox it out and read it. He says, these are paraphrases, but they're pretty close to quotes. He says that we must not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. You know, we're the best judges of their interests. We smart guys. We must therefore ensure that those idiots out there don't get into trouble, you know, by actually using their theoretical right to vote to interfere where they don't belong, like in the public arena. So we got to keep them out of the public arena somehow and make sure that it's just us smart guys who are in there. Now, it's for their good, of course. It's kind of like you don't let, you know, your 3-year-old, in my case, grandchild, run across the street, you know, because she may want to run across the street, but it'd be improper to let her have that choice. And the same is true about the masses. They have to be controlled. They have to be controlled at the workplace. They have to be kept out of the political arena. They're not going to understand the need to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. They're going to have all these strange leveling impulses, and they're going to do all kinds of things which will, you know, mess the world up in all sorts of horrible ways. So for their benefit, we have to regiment their minds the way an army regiments their bodies, ensure that they're under control, make it very clear that they don't participate in workplace management, and certainly not in the political arena. They're to be outside somewhere. And the dedication with which this task has been pursued is pretty awesome. If you, I mean, just to take a, right after the fall of the House of Labor in the 1920s, when American labor really was smashed, and people were privatized and tried to accommodate individually to a most undemocratic America, as Montgomery and others have pointed out. That was a time when there was great sort of, you know, awe about the end of history and the utopia of the masters, and it's all over, you know, us good guys have won, everybody else is at our feet. Kind of like some of the stuff you read today. And it sort of looked like that. You know, it's pretty much looked that way. Well, a few years later, as you know, the whole thing collapsed, and there was militant working class struggle and all sorts of other popular activism, and there had to be an accommodation. There had to be some kind of accommodation to these unwashed masses who were getting out of line, you know, sit-down strikes and all sorts of things, and there was indeed. There was this fragile social compact that Doug Fraser referred to, was indeed established. It wasn't a gift, you know, it was won by struggle. Meaning the labor laws and the limited social system. In fact, American workers back in the 1930s began to get the rights that had been standard long before, even in much more brutal societies. You read the right-wing British press over the, say, early part of this century, they can't believe how bad American workers are treated. The same was true of visitors from Australia and so on. By the 1930s, the U.S. was sort of brought into the more or less the mainstream of industrial society on these matters, to a limited extent, in fact, but to some extent. That caused hysteria among the masters. You read the business press by 1936 or 37. Again, these are things which in a really free society everybody would study in elementary school, because they're really important. These give the real framework of the society, in my view. They were talking about the hazard facing industrialists and the rising political power of the masses, and how we must do something to save ourselves or our way of life will be gone and we don't have a lot of time to do it. They started right away. By the late 30s, there was a big anti-labor campaign that had built up. With new techniques, you know. There was still use of force, but it was understood that that's not going to work the way it did. So there was a shift to more propaganda, community organization. The main idea, it's called the Mohawk Valley formula, I guess that was called, something like that. Yeah, Mohawk Valley formula was designed by a lot of public relations hotshots around 36, 37, at the time of some of the steel strikes, to have a new, what they called scientific methods of strike breaking. We don't just come in, you know, with clubs and shoot people and smash their heads and that sort of thing. We do it the scientific way, because the old way doesn't work anymore. And the scientific methods of strike breaking were in fact drawn from the public relations ideas of the kind that I talked about. The main idea was to mobilize the community against the strikers and the union activists, to present a picture which is by now so standard that you can hardly turn on the tube without seeing it, because it's just poured out in you know, like streams ever since then. The basic idea is to present a picture of the world that looks kind of like this. There's us, you know, kind of big happy family in the community. You know, the honest workman going off every morning with his lunchbox, his loyal wife who's making the meals and taking care of the kids, the hard-working executive who's toiling day and night in the interests of you know, his workers in the community, the friendly banker who's running around looking for people to lend money to, and so on and so forth. That's us, you know. And we're all in harmony. Harmony is a big word. We're in harmony, we're all together. It's Americanism. You might take a look at that word Americanism. It's an unusual term. It's the kind of term that you only find in totalitarian societies, as far as I know. So like in the Soviet Union, anti-Sovietism was considered the gravest of all crimes, you know. And the Brazilian generals had some concept like that, anti-Brazilian. But try, say, publishing a book on anti-Italianism and see what happens in the streets of Rome or Milan. And people won't even bother laughing. It's a ludicrous idea. The idea of Italianism or Norwayism or something like that, these would just be objects of ridicule in societies that have some kind of residue of a democratic culture inside people's heads. I don't mean in the formal systems. But in totalitarian societies it is used, and as far as I know, the United States is the only free society that has such a concept. Maybe there's another one. If it is, you might try it in places, But anyhow, Americanism is an anti-Americanism and un-Americanism and so on. These are concepts which go along with harmony and getting rid of those outsiders and all that kind of stuff. Another part is simply to induce hatred and fear among people. So it's a diverse society. You go to Europe, most places are pretty uniform. This is a very diverse society. So it's easy for propagandists. It's pretty easy to get people to hate the guy next door because he looks a little different or one thing or another. And huge campaigns go on to instigate divisions among people. I don't have to tell you about this, it's all so familiar. Go on. But these are very natural techniques of social control. Now, if you can't control people by force, you have to control their minds, you have to control their attitudes, you have to, exactly like they say. Well, going back to the Mohawk Valley formula, the idea was to move into a community, flood it with, where there's a strike going on, flood it with propaganda, take over the media, the churches, the schools, everywhere else, pour in this propaganda about harmony and so on, the way I described it. And then there's those bad guys out there who are trying to disrupt our harmonious lives. Like that union organizer is probably a communist or an anarchist anyway, and probably un-American, and he's trying to destroy all these wonderful things we had, and we got to band together and kick him out. We have to defend our way of life against this. A lot of religion gets thrown in. Remember that the United States is an extremely fundamentalist country. I mean, you look comparative statistics. Usually religious fundamentalism declines as industrialization goes up. It's pretty close correlation. The United States is off the chart. It ranks with devastated peasant societies, probably more fundamentalist than Iran. There's all, why this is so, I don't know. But in fact, it's a complicated question. But one factor is that it was certainly consciously fomented by business leaders. That goes way back to the 19th century, when they were supporting their favorite, John D. Rockefeller's favorite evangelist was, who he poured a lot of money into, was some guy who said that people ought to have more enlightened ideas than labor agitation. That was one of his famous phrases. And the more enlightened ideas are, go to church and listen to orders and do what they tell you and shut up. That's the more enlightened idea. And it's a really interesting case because the Mohawk Valley was the model that was later used for strike breaking and destruction of the labor movement in the post-war period. So it's quite interesting to see what happened right there. Incidentally, I don't know any literature on this. Do you? Yeah. So these are untouchable topics. And you can almost say that anything that's important, it's going to matter for people's lives, it's got to be sort of off the agenda. And it sort of makes sense. You don't want people to know about it. Like, you don't want people to know the wrong kind of thing. After all, that makes sense. It's like it's not a conspiracy or anything. It's just common sense if you have a certain degree of power and authority and privilege. You just don't want people to know things that might be harmful to them because they're really like children, remember. And we're the ones who have to make the decisions for them. There's an enormous amount of money and effort goes into this. It's not the only thing by any means. There's a lot of other reasons why the United States is so unusual in this respect, but this is one of them. And it's used. Whether that's the source or not, it's certainly used, always. So another technique of trying to create the marginalization of people, the removing people from the actual social and political struggles that might make their lives better. Maybe and to keep them from working with one another by dividing them up in all sorts of ways. And in a myriad techniques, find a fashion to keep the hated masses out of the public arena where they don't belong. And certainly out of anything having to do with control of the economic system where it's unthinkable that they should have a role. That's got to be in the hands of private tyrannies. That's unquestionable. Where the United States has acted internationally, it's the same way. you look at the trail of intervention, it's almost always the same. They're not just third world countries, for example. Like I just came back from Italy. Okay, you may not know this, but Italy was the target of the major CIA activities since its origins. The internal record runs dry around the mid-70s, so can't say after that. But from the origin of the CIA in 1947 up to at least the mid-70s, Italy seems to have been targeted more than any other country in an effort to undermine Italian democracy. Italy was regarded as sort of a semi-third world country, had a very strong labor movement. And when the American Army, in fact the American British armies, what they called liberating Italy in 1943-44, they were appalled to discover that northern Italy had been liberated by the resistance, which had established a functioning society with very strong labor control. The resistance was mostly labor and peasant based. They'd held off the Germans, had liberated most of the place. They had instituted worker management in factories. They had thrown out what were called, what the Americans and British, they were protecting workers, what they call, I'm now speaking for the terminology of the US British documents. They were keeping useless workers and throwing out, arbitrarily dismissing owners and bosses. And that's of course intolerable. And the system was functioning. And furthermore, they were focusing on unemployment, which was recognized was Italy's major problem. That's their problem, not our problem. Our problem is to restore the traditional structure, which meant traditional hierarchies. Actually, it meant restoring fascist structures and fascist collaborators and so on. And a big effort was made to do that. And it was not entirely successful. By 1948, when the first election took place, it looked as if labor-based forces would probably win. And a huge effort went into trying to ensure that that wouldn't happen by withholding food. Italy was starving, by restoring the police to fascist control, by all sorts of threats and manipulation. Pretty big operation, and the first major CIA operation among others. And they took it really seriously. Again, something you would learn in a free society is there's a thing called the National Security Council, which the main planning outfit, which publishes, doesn't publish, but it produces documents, top-level planning documents, which are among, not the only important ones, but among the most important ones. They tend to get released maybe 35 years later, so you can look back at them. So we have them now from the late 40s. And the first one, NSC 1, 1947, is devoted to Italy. And it calls for, it says, we're going to try all these measures to ensure that Italy doesn't have a free democratic government, which would have, they don't say it this way, but what amounts to, that, in which there'd be a big role for the organized working class in Italy. And they say, but if this doesn't work, if the communists, as they call them, which means, in fact, a lot of them were communists, but if the communists come to power through a legal vote, through a legal election, then the United States is going to declare a national emergency and is going to support military activities inside Italy to overthrow the democratically elected government. That's how seriously they took it back in 1947. They also knew exactly why the communists were powerful. You read it in the records extensively. It's because they were honest, because they were supporting working class interests. It's true that they were collaborationists. They weren't trying to separate Italy from the Western Alliance or anything, but they were defending working class interests and people supported them. They had a mass-based working class party. There were plenty of others besides communists. But they had to be prevented either by coercion, like, say, withholding food and violence, or if that didn't work, by direct intervention, military intervention. It was taken very seriously, and in fact, it goes up to the present.
How is it that the wealthy can pull the wool over the eyes of the American worker by controlling the power in government and using it against the working public, using it against labor people?
Well, take right now, let's say, as an example. There's a couple days ago, I don't know if you're bothered, I put myself through the pain of reading the New York Times every day for some masochistic reason, which I won't try to explain. But they've got their big chief correspondent, sort of the main thinker, is a guy named Thomas Friedman. who had an article 3 or 4 days ago, in which he, big think piece, in which he said, well, he said the Cold War's over, so the breakdown isn't hawks and doves anymore. We have to have some new breakdown. And he said the new breakdown, he says there's two. One is between integrationists and what's the other term? I forget. Anti-integrationists. That means people who are in favor of more globalization and what they call free trade, which isn't free trade, and all that kind of stuff. And people who want to slow it down or end it. That's one break. And the other is between people who are in favor of a safety net and those who think that everybody ought to, be on your own and get what you can. Okay, so those are the two ways people break up. And that gives you four possible types of people, right? Two of them he sort of dismisses as lunatics. So there's the Zapatistas and Ross Perot. They fit into two of those boxes. The other two boxes are sort of sane people, Clinton and Gingrich. And I'll put aside Clinton, but Gingrich, and this gets right to your point, I think, Gingrich is put in the corner that says integrationist and they'll take the hindmost, everybody for themselves. Well, that's testable. It's testable that that's Gingrich's position. For example, on the question of whether Gingrich is an integrationist, like in favor of free trade, we can ask how he reacted when the Reagan administration instituted the greatest wave of protectionism since the 1930s. That's just straight protectionism, alongside a huge increase in public subsidies to private power, to industry, along with, say, the biggest nationalization in American history, the takeover of Continental Illinois Bank, and so on and so forth. That's all radically anti-integrationist. Okay, how did Gingrich react? We can ask that question. Answer is he thought it was great. What about the safety net story? I mean, Gingrich is in favor of people sort of being out there on their own, rugged entrepreneurs and so on. I mean, you can check that too. He represents the county, district, Cobb County, Georgia, which happens to be and he happens to hold the national championship in bringing federal subsidies to his rich constituents, to be precise, among suburban counties in the United States. Cobb County ranks third in federal subsidies, ranks right after Arlington, Virginia, which is part of the federal government. So, of course, they get a lot of federal subsidies, like the Pentagon's there and so on. And Brevard County, Florida, which is the home of the Space Center. So it's another part of the federal government. But if you move outside the federal government itself, Gingrich's district is number one. They get more federal subsidies than anybody. The biggest employer in Cobb County is Lockheed, which is a publicly subsidized private profit corporation. They don't, they sell commercial planes, but those are just, as everyone knows, they're just, they use military technology is, the way the system is designed, technology is developed under the guise of the military and then handed over to private power when it works.
Okay, so, Brother R.A., I give much respect to Noam Chomsky, the melanin recessive inbred mutant albino with the calcified pineal gland. Noam Chomsky propaganda and control of the public mind. I'm still trying to figure out, what's this coloring book say? Who am I? Tell me who I am. And after watching, I did get to watch Aquila in the spelling bee. And who are we as melanin dominant people? And what was John Quincy Adams' speech at the end of Amistad? Please watch that again. And are we just Manchurian candidates where our minds are controlled? And let me just say this too. I am one of two black men on Fort Hill practicing what I describe as meditation in movement. But Master Heej, the gentleman standing beside me, teaches me that it's Tai Chi. And that is a melanin dominant Asian word, but for me as a melanin dominant black man tapping into who I am and reading the Tao, let's continue with that. We got 20 minutes left or less than that. I hope I covered all my points. Oh, I was showing my feet and the particular shirt because that with that type of information, practicing Tai Chi, propaganda, control of the public mind, delving deep within myself, I take care of all aspects of my mind and body. In my body, I showed the bronze shoes. What path am I on? And in looking for the mother of my children at, what am I, 57? 57 years old, and you saw my feet, the mother has to have taken care of her feet and delved deep into herself. So last week I dealt with the first 5 pages of the Tao, along with perception, but let me just shut up and start reading. Emerging, page 6. Thunder and rain at night. Growth comes with a shock. Expression and duration appear in the first moment. Things cannot remain in stillness forever. Winter storms may destroy some things, but they also prepare the way for life. If things are swept away, it is appropriate. There must be an opportunity for new living things to emerge and begin on their own cycle. All growth comes with a shock. When a sprout breaks its casing and forces its way to the surface of the earth, it is the climax to a long and deep accumulation of life force. We may think that it came up suddenly, but in actuality, it emerged as the product of unseen and subtle cycles. When the seedling appears, it carries with it the complete pattern for its growth. Perhaps even the makings of an enormous tree. Although time and the right conditions are necessary, neither of those factors adds anything to the inherent nature of the seedling. It completely embodies its destiny. Therefore, the growth and character of the plant and its very life are all present at the moment of emerging. Forbearance. And I'm just living life one day at a time, and what are we talking about? The minority of the opulent, mind control, and the minority of the opulent think it's a joke to have Trump as a president? Page 7. Forbearance. Oh, let's not forget all the sports and entertainment of the media. Oh my God, New England, the Patriots, the basketball, the Bruins. I was reluctant to say that on my show, but let's continue. Forbearance. Arctic breath coils the mountain, rattling the forest bones. Raindrops cling to branches, jeweled adornment flung to earth. Trees in winter lose their leaves. Some trees may even fall during storms. But most stand patiently and bear their fortune. They endure rain, snow, wind, and cold. They bear the adornment of glycerin raindrops, glimmering icicles, or crowns of snow without care. They are not concerned when such lustrous splendor is dashed to the ground. They stand and they wait. The power of their growth, apparently dormant, but inside, a burgeoning is building imperceptibly. There is the forbearance of being true to their inner natures. It is without this power that they withstand both the vicissitudes and the adornments of life. For neither bad fortune nor good fortune will alter what they are. We should be the same way. We may have great fortune or bad, but we should patiently bear both. No matter what, we must always be true to our inner selves. So, melanin dominant, biological, living, light dominant, reaching the pinnacle of my first eye, reaching the greatest inner essence of who I am. Understanding that I am one with this verse. Are you one with the verse? Are you tapping into your divine energies and self despite the propaganda and control of your mind by public nonsense? Alright, let's go ahead. I got 9 minutes or less. So that was 6 and 7. Let's see if we can get to 8 and 9. Work is 8. The woodcutter works in all seasons. Splitting wood is both action and inaction. Even when it is snowy, the woodcutter must split wood. Unless he does, he and his family will not stay warm. And those who depend upon him will not survive. But the woodcutter does not work simply on a piecemeal basis. He labors in concert with the seasons. He worked hard to store wood prior to the first cold, so that he would have the luxury of merely kindling now. His work seems slight in one season because he was industrious in the previous one. When he splits wood, he must place the log on the block and raise his axe. But he must strike the wood with the grain, and he must let the axe fall with its own weight. If he tries to chop across the grain, his effort would be wasted. If he tries to add strength to the swing of the axe, there would be no gain. Like the woodcutter, we can all benefit from working according to seasonal circumstances, whether it is time or the method. The true labor is half initiative and half knowing how to let things proceed on their own. Optimism. 9, the sphere, top the stem. You are that one. Now, is your sphere at the top of your one? Optimism. Clearing blue sky, a promise in bare branches. In winter, there are sunny days. In adulthood, childhood can return. In winter, all things appear dead or dormant. The rain and snow seem incessant, the nights long. Then one day the sky clears to a brilliant blue. The air warms. A mist rises from the earth, and the perfume of water, clay, and moss drifts through the air. Gardeners are seen preparing new stock, though they are only bare branches and a gray root ball. The people are optimistic. They know that there will be an end to the cold. In adulthood, we often see responsibilities as something dreadful. Why should we dig the ground when the winter is so disagreeable? We see activities only as obligations, and we strain against our fate. But there is a joy to working in harmony with the proper time. When we do things at just the right occasion and those efforts bear fruits later, the gratification is tremendous. There was an old man who began an orchard upon his retirement. Everyone laughed at him. Why plant trees? They told him that he